My parents ignored my struggles for years. At my 32nd birthday dinner, I casually said I sold my company, your little worthless data business. For how much? My brother laughed. I looked him dead in the eye and said $80 million. His jaw fell. Mom turned pale. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The evening started like every other forced family gathering in my life. We were sitting in a private dining room at one of the most expensive steakhouses in Buckhead, Atlanta. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the white tablecloth, but the atmosphere at our table was anything but warm. I sat quietly sipping my sparkling water, while my family treated my 32nd birthday dinner like a personal spending spree. They had ordered the dry-aged tomahawk steaks, the imported truffles, and 3 bottles of vintage wine. I had ordered a simple salmon fillet. I knew exactly how this game was played. I had been playing it my entire life. My brother Trayvon sat across from me holding court. At 35 years old, he was still living the illusion of being a successful real estate investor. In reality, he was a master at spending our parents' retirement savings on bad property flips and designer suits. Beside him sat his wife, Ashley. Ashley was a 31-year-old white woman who had perfected the art of insulting me while sounding absolutely innocent. She wore a tennis bracelet my parents had bought her for Christmas, and a condescending smile she reserved exclusively for me. My parents, Brenda and Calvin, sat at the head of the table nodding along to every word Trayvon said. In their eyes, Trayvon could do no wrong. He was the golden child, the handsome son, who was going to build generational wealth and make them look good in front of their megachurch congregation. I was just Corinne, the stubborn daughter who spent too much time on her computer and refused to settle down and give them grandchildren. The waiter approached our table carrying a black leather folder. He looked around hesitantly, unsure of who the host was. Before I could even reach into my purse, Ashley leaned over and snatched the folder from the waiter's hand. She did not even open it. She just slid it directly across the white tablecloth until it hit my water glass. "Corinne, you grabbed this, right?" Ashley said, her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "Trayvon and I are saving for our Aspen ski trip this winter. And since you do not have a husband or kids to spend your money on, your little computer hobby must leave you with plenty of disposable income." The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the air. My little computer hobby. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a healthcare data software company. I had spent the last 7 years working 100-hour weeks, securing government contracts, and building an analytics platform that hospitals across the country relied on. But to Ashley and my family, I was just a single black woman playing with spreadsheets in a home office. I looked at my mother, expecting her to intervene. Instead, Brenda took a delicate sip of her wine and nodded. "Ashley is right," Brenda said smoothly. "You have the least financial responsibilities here. Trayvon has a household to maintain and a very stressful business to run. It is only fair that you treat us tonight. After all, it is your birthday. We are gracing you with our presence." I did not argue. Arguing with them was like talking to a brick wall. I simply unzipped my purse, pulled out my American Express black card, and placed it on the bill. The total was over $1,500. I did not blink. I handed the folder back to the waiter. Trayvon caught a glimpse of the heavy metal card before the waiter walked away. His eyes widened slightly. He adjusted his posture, leaning across the table with a sudden, intense interest. "You know, Corinne, seeing you throw around that kind of plastic reminds me of something." Trayvon began, using his best salesman voice. "I am closing a massive deal next week, a luxury residential flip in a highly sought-after neighborhood. The profit margins are guaranteed to be huge, but the bank is giving me a hard time about the liquid cash requirements. I need $50,000 by Wednesday to secure the escrow." I stared at him. "You are asking me for $50,000 right after your wife forced me to pay for your steak dinner?" Ashley scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Oh, do not be so aggressive, Corinne. Trayvon is offering you an investment opportunity. You should be grateful he is willing to let you in on his real estate empire. You always get so defensive when we try to include you in family business." "It is not an aggressive question, Ashley. I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. It is a factual observation. Calvin. My father cleared his throat loudly. Do not speak to your sister-in-law with that tone, Corinne. Your brother is asking for a simple favor. Family helps family. You know the struggles we face as a community in the business world. We have to stick together to build our legacy. I looked at my father, the same man who refused to co-sign a small business loan for me 7 years ago because he said women belonged in secure corporate jobs, not risky startups. I do not have $50,000 to give you for a house flip. Trayvon, I said plainly. Trayvon slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware rattle. Come on, Corinne, stop lying. I saw that card. You have the cash. And quite frankly, you owe me. I owe you? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yes, you owe me, Trayvon snapped, leaning closer. 5 years ago, when you were crying about needing to file your limited liability company paperwork, I gave you $500 out of my own pocket. I funded your start. Without my money, you would still be working some dead-end data entry job. You owe your entire computer hobby to me. It is time you pay your brother back and support the real breadwinner of this family. The action-based backstory he was twisting was almost laughable. 5 years ago, I had been short on my filing fees because my parents had manipulated me into paying for Trayvon's car repairs. I asked Trayvon for a temporary loan. He gave me $500, but forced me to pay it back with a 20% interest rate 3 months later. I had literally starved myself eating plain rice for weeks to get him his money back because he threatened to sue me if I was late. Brenda reached over and patted Trayvon's hand soothingly. He is right, Corinne. Trayvon was there for you when you needed him. Now he needs $50,000 to secure his future. It is the Christian thing to do. You cannot be greedy with your blessings. I took a deep breath. The steakhouse murmured with the sounds of other patrons enjoying their evening, completely unaware of the psychological warfare happening at our table. I looked at the 4 people sitting with me. They were so confident in their superiority. They were so convinced that I was still the scared, desperate girl they had treated like a scapegoat for 3 decades. I wiped my mouth with my linen napkin and placed it gently on the table. I cannot give you $50,000, Trayvon. I said, my voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the table fall completely silent. Because my assets are currently frozen in a transition holding account. Trayvon let out a loud, mocking laugh. A transition holding account? Listen to you trying to sound like a Wall Street banker. What transition, Corinne? Did your little app crash? Did you finally go bankrupt? I told you that you should have taken that accounting job at the city. Ashley giggled, covering her mouth. I guess the black card is just for show then. How embarrassing. I did not go bankrupt, Trayvon, I said, locking eyes with him. I sold my company yesterday afternoon. The laughter stopped abruptly. Trayvon stared at me, his forehead wrinkling in confusion. You sold it? He scoffed. Your little worthless data business, who would buy that? For how much, $100,000? Maybe enough to pay off your student loans if you are lucky. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table. The acquiring firm is a major medical technology conglomerate. They purchased my software, my government contracts, and my entire client database. The sale price was $80 million. The silence that followed was absolute. Brenda dropped her heavy silver fork. It clattered against her porcelain plate, echoing sharply in the quiet room. Calvin choked on his scotch, coughing violently into his napkin. Ashley's smug smile vanished instantly, her face turning an ugly shade of red. Trayvon's jaw literally fell open. He stared at me like I had just spoken a foreign language. 80, he stammered, his voice cracking. 80 million. Yes, I replied smoothly. $80 million. I signed the final acquisition papers yesterday at noon. I am officially the chief executive officer of a subsidiary division now. So no, Trayvon, I cannot give you $50,000 for your imaginary real estate flip. Because my wealth management team has advised me against investing in high-risk, low-yield liabilities, which is exactly what you are. I watched the exact moment the shock in Trayvon's eyes mutated into something dark and malicious. He did not offer congratulations. He did not express pride in his sister. Instead, his mind desperately scrambled for a way to assert dominance over a situation he could no longer control. His face twisted into a greedy, furious sneer. $80 million, he whispered, looking frantically between me and our parents. $80 million. He suddenly sat back in his chair, a slow, terrifying smile spreading across his face. He began to laugh again, but this time it was not mocking, it was triumphant. 80 million, Trevon said, pointing a finger at me. That is perfect. That is absolutely perfect, Corinne, because you seem to have forgotten a very important detail about how your company started. What detail is that? I asked, my heart remaining perfectly steady. That $500 I gave you 5 years ago? Trevon said, his voice rising with excitement. That was not a loan. We sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote it out on a napkin. We signed it. That $500 was seed capital, Corinne. Calvin suddenly sat up straight, his eyes darting to Trevon. Seed capital, yes, Trevon said, looking at our father for validation. I gave her the initial investment to start the limited liability company. That makes me an angel investor. That makes me a founding partner. Ashley slammed her hand on the table, her eyes wide with sudden greed. Oh my God, Trevon is right. You used his money to start the business, Corinne. That means half of everything you just sold belongs to him. I stared at them, watching the absolute delusion take hold of their minds. They were actually convincing themselves in real time that my 7 years of blood, sweat, and tears belonged to the brother who had mocked me every single day of that journey. Brenda found her voice, her hands shaking as she grasped the edge of the table. Corinne, you have to do the right thing here. Your brother invested in you. $40 million is more than enough for you to live comfortably. You have to give Trevon his rightful share. It is family law. There is no such thing as family law, Mom, I said coldly. And I paid you back Trevon, 3 months later, with interest. I do not care what you paid back? Trevon sneered, leaning over the table until his face was inches from mine. A loan payback does not dissolve equity. I have that napkin, Corinne. I have your signature. I own 50% of your worthless little data business, which means I own 50% of that $80 million. He picked up his wine glass and took a victorious sip, staring at me with pure, unadulterated entitlement. Do not make any plans for that money, little sister, Trevon said, his voice dripping with malice. Enjoy your birthday tonight, because my lawyers will be contacting you on Monday morning. The silence in the private dining room was so heavy, it felt like it could suffocate me. I looked at the 4 faces staring back at me across the pristine white tablecloth. Trevon wore a grin of absolute triumph, convinced he had just secured a $40 million payday from a napkin he kept in his wallet. Ashley was already looking at the dessert menu, her posture relaxed, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of wealth she had done absolutely nothing to earn. My parents, however, were the ones who truly broke my heart. My mother, Brenda, had stopped clutching her chest. The initial shock of my $80 million sale had faded, completely replaced by a terrifying calm. She looked at Trevon, then looked at me, her expression hardening into the same judgmental stare she used whenever I failed to meet her impossible standards. Calvin. My father cleared his throat. He set his heavy crystal glass down and folded his hands on the table. Corinne, he began, his voice carrying the deep, authoritative resonance he used when addressing his congregation. Your brother has a valid point. Business is business. If he provided the initial seed capital for your venture, then he is legally and morally entitled to his share of the harvest. I stared at the man who had raised me. Are you actually agreeing with him? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. You are taking his side over a $500 loan from 5 years ago. It is not about taking sides, Corinne, Calvin said, shifting in his leather chair. It is about building the family legacy. Trevon is a married man. He is the head of his household. He is trying to build an empire in real estate to carry our name forward. You are a single woman. You have no husband, no children to provide for. $40 million is more money than you could ever spend in one lifetime. Give your brother his $40 million. It is the right thing to do for the family. Brenda nodded enthusiastically, reaching across the table to squeeze Trayvon's hand. Listen to your father, Corinne. You have to understand that as a black man in America, your brother faces obstacles you simply do not comprehend. He needs this capital to solidify his position in the market. You should be proud to support him. You should be honored that God used you as a vessel to bless your brother. I felt a cold laugh rising in my throat. I swallowed it down, refusing to give them the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. For 32 years, I had been the designated mule of this family. Expected to carry the weight, expected to stay in the background, expected to sacrifice my own stability so the golden boy could shine. Trayvon pulled his smartphone from his pocket. He tapped the screen a few times and slid it across the table toward me. Here is the proof, he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. I took a picture of it last year, just in case you ever tried to conveniently forget where you came from. I looked down at the bright screen. It was a photograph of a stained cocktail napkin from a cheap diner. On it, in my messy 27-year-old handwriting, were the words, I, Corinne, acknowledge the receipt of $500 from Trayvon to be used for the establishment of my software limited liability company. Underneath it was my signature. See, Ashley chimed in, her tone sickly sweet. It is right there in black and white, Corinne. A legal contract. You really should just write the check and save everyone the embarrassment of a drawn-out court battle. We can handle it quietly and keep the family peace. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. Instead, I reached down into my structured designer tote bag. As a founder who dealt with aggressive venture capitalists and cutthroat hospital administrators on a daily basis, I had learned a long time ago that paper beats posturing every single time. I pulled out a crisp manila envelope and placed it gently on the table next to Trayvon's phone. What is that? Brenda asked, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. That is a certified financial dossier, I replied, my voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. I anticipated you might try something like this, Trayvon. You have always possessed an inflated sense of entitlement regarding my money. So before I finalized the sale of my company to the holding group, I had my legal team conduct a full audit of all early financial contributions to ensure a clean chain of title. Trayvon scoffed, crossing his arms. You can audit all you want. That napkin holds up in court. It proves I am an equity partner. Actually, it proves you are a predator, I corrected him smoothly. I opened the envelope and extracted a bank-certified document, sliding it directly over the picture of the napkin on his phone. But it certainly does not prove you own anything. Calvin leaned forward, squinting at the document. What am I looking at, Corinne? You are looking at a certified copy of a cashier's check from Bank of America, I explained, detailing the specifics with clinical precision. Dated exactly 90 days after the date on that napkin. The amount is for $600. Trayvon frowned, looking at the paper. So what? You paid me back. That does not erase my initial equity position. I was an angel investor. Read the memo line on the check, Trayvon. I instructed, my voice dropping to a whisper that commanded the entire room. Read it aloud for the table. Trayvon stared at the paper, his jaw tightening. He remained silent. Fine, I will read it, I said, picking up the document. The memo line clearly states repayment of $500 personal loan plus 20% interest in full and final satisfaction of all debts and claims. And right below that is the bank stamp showing you endorsed and cashed this check personally. The air in the room seemed to evaporate. I watched the color drain from Trayvon's face as the reality of his legal standing collapsed in real time. By cashing that check with that specific legal designation, I continued leaning forward so he could see the absolute finality in my eyes. You formally accepted the terms of repayment. You legally classified your contribution as a high-interest microloan, not an equity investment. You relinquished any and all claims to my company 5 years ago for a miserable $100 profit. You do not own 50% of my business, Trayvon. You do not own a single line of code. My lawyers will not be hearing from you on Monday because any judge in this state would throw your frivolous lawsuit out before lunch and sanction your attorney for wasting the court's time. The silence returned heavy and suffocating. Brenda looked frantically between the bank document and her precious son. But Trayvon, she stammered, her voice wavering. You said you were a partner. You said you owned half. He lied, Mom, I stated simply. He lied because the thought of my success without his involvement is entirely unacceptable to his fragile ego. Suddenly, Ashley pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping violently against the hardwood floor. She stood up, her face contorted into a mask of pure indignation. She had relied on that $40 million to fund her lifestyle, and watching it vanish ignited a desperate fury inside her. You people are all the same, Ashley shouted, pointing a trembling finger at me. Her voice had abandoned its previous sweet tone, replaced by the shrill, aggressive pitch of a woman accustomed to getting her way by playing the victim. She looked around the restaurant, her eyes seeking out the other affluent white diners, hoping to weaponize their implicit bias against me. You are so greedy, Ashley continued, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. You sit there with your fancy bags and your $80 million, acting like you are better than everyone else. Trayvon deserves that money. He works himself to the bone while you just sit behind a screen. His real estate empire is keeping this entire family afloat. You are a selfish, aggressive woman trying to steal from your own brother. Her use of the word aggressive was a deliberate, calculated microaggression designed to paint me as the angry black woman and herself as the fragile defender of family values. I saw my parents tense, uncomfortable with the scene Ashley was causing in public, but neither of them told her to sit down. They allowed her to disrespect me because she was defending their golden child. I let her finish her performance. I waited until the echoes of her accusations settled into the quiet corners of the room. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. Keeping the family afloat, I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. I set the glass down and locked eyes with my sister-in-law. Is that the bedtime story Trayvon tells you, Ashley? That his real estate empire is keeping the lights on? It is the truth, she snapped, crossing her arms defensively. He is building neighborhoods. He is a developer. I let out a short, cold laugh that made Ashley flinch. A developer, I repeated, shaking my head at the sheer magnitude of their shared delusion. I reached back into the manila envelope. Did you know that when you sell a company for $80 million, the acquiring firm runs a deep background check on your immediate family members? They have to ensure there are no financial liabilities or criminal elements that could cause a public relations scandal. Trayvon suddenly went completely rigid. His eyes darted to the envelope. Corinne, shut up, he hissed, his voice low and panicked. I ignored him, pulling out a thick stack of printed financial reports. Ashley, I said, sliding the papers toward her. Trayvon has not sold a single piece of real estate in 3 years. His empire is a sham, a holding company with zero assets and a negative balance sheet. Ashley stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. That is a lie, she finally managed, her voice shaking. We have properties. We have investors. You have predatory loans. I corrected her, dissecting his financial ruin with absolute precision. Trayvon took out a massive mezzanine loan from a private equity firm 2 years ago to fund a luxury development project that never even broke ground. He spent the capital on cars, vacations, and designer watches to maintain the illusion of wealth. He is currently $2 million in debt. He has defaulted on the interest payments for 18 consecutive months. Trayvon slammed his hands on the table. I said, shut up, Corinne. That is none of her business. That is my private company information. It became my business when you tried to extort $40 million from me. I shot back, my voice finally rising to match his intensity. I looked back at Ashley, who was now staring at her husband in absolute horror. You are not wealthy, Ashley. You are standing on a house of cards that is actively burning to the ground. Your husband is broke. Ashley slowly sank back into her chair, all her previous righteous anger completely extinguished. She looked at Trayvon's expensive suit, then at the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist, realization slowly dawning on her face. $2 million, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Trayvon, you told me we were liquid. You told me the Aspen trip was already paid for. Trayvon refused to look at her. He stared at his plate, his jaw working furiously as his entire fabricated life was laid bare on the steakhouse table. I expected my parents to express shock. I expected Calvin to demand an explanation from his son. I expected Brenda to scold Trayvon for lying to his wife and leading the family to believe he was a successful businessman. Instead, Brenda began to take short, shallow breaths. Her hand flew to her chest, her manicured fingers clutching the fabric of her blouse. Her eyes were wide, fixed entirely on me, not Trayvon. Calvin turned a sickly shade of gray. The commanding presence of the family patriarch vanished instantly, replaced by the terrifying realization of a man staring over the edge of a cliff. His hands began to shake slightly against the white tablecloth. He looked at Trayvon, then looked at the financial report sitting in front of Ashley. Corinne Calvin stammered, his voice stripped of all its former authority. He sounded old, suddenly fragile. The word hung in the air, trembling with an unspoken terror. "What is it, Dad?" I asked, a sickening realization beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. The way he was shaking, the way Brenda was struggling to breathe, it went far beyond the shock of Trayvon's personal debt. There was a deeper, darker secret hiding beneath the surface of this disaster. Calvin swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He could not look me in the eye. He stared at his trembling hands. When Trayvon needed the capital for that luxury development, Calvin began, his voice cracking slightly. He came to us. He said the private equity firm required collateral, substantial collateral to secure the $2 million release. He said it was just a formality, just paperwork to satisfy the underwriters until the property's sold. Brenda let out a small stifled sob, covering her mouth with both hands. I felt the temperature in the room plummet. The steakhouse noise faded into a dull buzz in my ears. "What did you do, Dad?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, unyielding whisper. "What collateral did you give him?" Calvin finally forced himself to meet my gaze. His eyes were entirely hollow, filled with the devastating reality of his own catastrophic failure. "We put the family house up, Corinne." Calvin confessed, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic and shame. "We mortgaged the house we live in, and we used your grandmother's historic estate as the secondary guarantor. We signed the papers. We pledged it all to secure your brother's loan." The breath left my lungs. My grandmother's estate was a historic property sitting on 20 acres of prime land. It had been in our family for 4 generations. It was the physical embodiment of our ancestors' struggle and survival. It was sacred, and they had handed it over to a predatory private equity firm to fund Trayvon's delusions of grandeur. And since Trayvon has not made the payments, Calvin continued, his voice dropping to a desperate, terrified whisper, they activated the default clauses. They sent the final notices on Tuesday. They are foreclosing on everything, Corinne. They are seizing the family house and your grandmother's estate next Friday. We are going to lose it all. Calvin's voice broke on the last word. The silence that followed was suffocating. I stared at the man who had always demanded respect, who had built his entire identity around being the infallible patriarch. Now he was just a terrified man who had gambled his family's history on his son's delusions and lost everything. Brenda buried her face in her hands, sobbing openly now. The dignified church elder facade was gone. "They are going to take the house, Calvin," she wailed. "Where are we going to go? What are we going to tell the congregation?" I looked at Trayvon. He was staring at the table, refusing to meet anyone's eye. The golden child, the supposed real estate mogul, had single-handedly bankrupted our parents. "Corinne," Calvin said, his voice pleading, "you have to help us. You just sold your company for $80 million. $2 million is nothing to you now. You can pay off Trayvon's debt and save your grandmother's estate. You can save our home." I sat back in my chair, studying the faces of the people who had spent my entire life, making me feel like an outsider in my own family. "You want me to pay $2 million to bail out the brother who just tried to extort $40 million from me?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Brenda looked up, her tear-streaked face twisting into a familiar mask of manipulation. "He is your brother, Corinne. she pleaded. We are your family. You cannot just let them take your grandmother's house. Think of her legacy. Think of what she sacrificed for that land. I thought of my grandmother. I thought of the fierce, independent woman who had taught me to read ledger books and understand compound interest while Brenda was busy buying Trevon designer clothes he did not need. I am thinking of her legacy, Mom, I said softly, which is exactly why I will not pay a dime of Trevon's debt. Calvin slammed his hand on the table, the loud smack echoing in the private room. You selfish, ungrateful girl! He shouted, the terror in his voice, replaced by the booming authority he was so used to wielding. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe this family. I owe this family. I repeated, my voice rising to meet his. Let us talk about what I owe this family, Dad. When I was 24 years old, sleeping in my Honda Civic in the university library parking lot during my finals, because my startup ran out of capital and I could not make rent, I called you. I asked you for a $500 loan just so I could eat something other than instant ramen while I finished my degree. Do you remember what you told me? Calvin stared at me, his jaw clenched. You told me that if I was struggling, it meant God was punishing me for being too ambitious. I said, the memory still burning in my chest. You told me to drop out, move home, and find a husband to support me. Brenda shook her head. We were trying to teach you independence, Corinne. We wanted you to be strong. You wanted me to fail, I corrected her sharply. Because a week later, while I was showering in the campus gym, you and Dad took Trayvon to Cabo San Lucas for his birthday. You spent $5,000 on a resort suite for a grown man who had just quit his third job in 2 years. You made your choices. You chose your golden child. Now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. You made this bed. Sleep in it. Ashley, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly stood up. Her chair scraped loudly against the floor. You are a monster, she hissed, her voice trembling with a terrifying blend of rage and entitlement. You sit there with your millions while your own parents are about to be homeless. You are exactly what people say you are. Aggressive, selfish, cold. I did not flinch. I looked at the white woman who had spent years making snide comments about my hair, my clothes, my single status. The woman who was now realizing the luxury lifestyle she thought she had married into was a complete fabrication. And you are broke, Ashley, I replied smoothly. Enjoy the Aspen trip. Ashley let out a sound of pure frustration, grabbed her designer handbag, and stormed out of the private dining room. Trayvon hesitated for a moment, looking between me and our parents, before scrambling up and chasing after her. Trayvon, wait! Brenda cried out, reaching for him, but he was already gone, leaving her alone with Calvin and the devastating reality of their impending ruin. I stood up, picking up my structured tote bag. Happy birthday to me, I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the steakhouse, leaving the $1,500 bill paid in full and a family entirely shattered by their own greed. I thought the worst was over. I thought the truth being exposed would finally force my family to confront the reality of their choices. But I had underestimated the dangerous combination of Trevon's desperation and Ashley's weaponized victimhood. The next morning, I woke up in my penthouse condo overlooking downtown Atlanta. I made myself a cup of coffee and opened my laptop to check my emails before heading to the office. My inbox was flooded. Not with the usual updates from my development team or congratulatory messages from the acquisition, but with hundreds of notifications from our public relations monitoring software. My stomach dropped as I clicked on the first alert. It was a link to a TikTok video. The thumbnail showed Ashley sitting in the driver's seat of her Range Rover. Her blonde hair was messy, her face was blotchy, and she was crying, genuine heaving sobs. The video already had over 2 million views. I pressed play. Hi, guys. Ashley began, her voice shaking as she wiped a tear from her cheek. I do not usually do this, but I am just so heartbroken and I do not know where else to turn. She took a shaky breath, looking directly into the camera. My husband's family is going through something unimaginable. My in-laws, Brenda and Calvin, are in their 60s. They are the sweetest, most generous people you will ever meet. They run a ministry at their church. but they are about to be evicted from their home. They are going to lose the historic estate that has been in their family for generations. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hand. They are losing everything because of a predatory loan. Ashley continued, crying harder now. And the worst part? The worst part is that my sister-in-law, Corinne, she just sold her tech company for $80 million. $80 million. We begged her for help. We asked her to just pay off the loan so her elderly parents would not be homeless. She paused, letting out a tragic little sob. But she refused. She sat there in a fancy restaurant and laughed at us. She said it was not her problem. She was so aggressive about it. She hates my husband because he is successful, and she is just so angry all the time. She is using her money to bully her own parents. Please, guys, share this. People need to know what kind of person Corinne really is. People need to know who is running this healthcare data company. The video ended. I sat there in stunned silence. She had completely twisted the narrative. She had weaponized her white tears, painting herself and my parents as innocent victims being bullied by the aggressive, wealthy black woman. She had conveniently omitted the fact that the predatory loan was taken out to fund her husband's fake real estate empire. She had omitted the fact that Trayvon tried to steal $40 million from me on a forged napkin. I scrolled through the comments. They were vicious. Cancel her company. What a horrible daughter. She should be ashamed. This is what happens when people get money, they forget their family. Has anyone contacted the company that bought her out? They need to see this. My phone started ringing. It was the private number for Marcus Vance, the chairman of the conglomerate that had just acquired my company. I answered, taking a steadying breath. Good morning, Marcus. Corinne. Marcus said, his voice tight and formal. Are you aware of the situation currently unfolding on social media? I am, I replied, keeping my tone professional. It is a fabricated narrative created by my sister-in-law. It is a private family matter that she is attempting to use for extortion. Private family matters do not trend on Twitter, Corinne. Marcus said sharply. The board is receiving hundreds of emails demanding we cancel the acquisition. Our shareholders do not like controversy, and they certainly do not like our new managing director being painted as a corporate bully, evicting her own elderly parents. I understand your concern, Marcus, I said, my mind racing. I have documentation that proves the entire video is a lie. I need more than documentation, Corinne. Marcus replied. I need this handled. The acquisition funds are currently in escrow. The board is holding an emergency meeting at 2:00 this afternoon. We expect you to be there in person to explain how you are going to make this public relations nightmare disappear. If you cannot resolve this, the board is prepared to invoke the morality clause and terminate the acquisition entirely. He hung up. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding against my ribs. $80 million. 7 years of my life. It was all hanging in the balance because Ashley knew exactly how to play the victim and manipulate the internet. I quickly dressed in my sharpest tailored suit, gathered my files, and headed to the corporate headquarters of the acquiring company. I arrived an hour early, needing time to strategize with my legal team before facing the board. As I walked into the expansive glass-walled lobby, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Checkmate, little sister. See you in the lobby. I stopped walking. I looked toward the visitor seating area. There, sitting on a plush leather sofa, looking entirely too pleased with themselves, were Trayvon and Ashley. Trayvon stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a smug smile. Ashley remained seated, her tear-stained face from the video replaced by a look of absolute triumph. What are you doing here? I demanded, walking over to them. Trayvon chuckled, casually checking his watch. We heard you had an important meeting today, Corinne. Something about your $80 million payout being put on hold because of a little video Ashley posted. Ashley smiled up at me. It has 5 million views now, Corinne. The internet really loves a tragic story. You committed libel, Ashley, I said, my voice dangerously low. You publicly defamed me and my company. My lawyers are already drafting the cease and desist. Trayvon waved his hand dismissively. By the time your lawyers file anything, the board will have canceled your deal. They do not want the bad press, Corinne. You know how these corporate guys operate. They spook easily. He took a step closer, his smile widening into a predatory grin. But it does not have to end this way. We can make it all go away. I stared at him, realizing the true depth of his depravity. You want to extort me. I want what is fair, Trayvon corrected smoothly. I am willing to let go of my 50% equity claim. I am willing to forget about the napkin. All you have to do is write me a check for $5 million right now. You pay off my debt, you save Mom and Dad's house, and you give Ashley and me enough capital to start fresh. Ashley nodded, pulling her phone from her purse. If the money clears the account, I will post an update video. I will say it was all a misunderstanding. I will say you are actually a wonderful sister who stepped up to save the family. The internet will love the redemption arc, and your board will approve the sale. Trevon crossed his arms, looking at me with absolute certainty. $5 million, Corinne, or Ashley goes on Good Morning America tomorrow for an exclusive interview and completely ruins your acquisition, your move. The absolute silence in the boardroom was intoxicating. I watched Trayvon's chest heave as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his complete and utter ruin was crashing down on him all at once. He was not a mogul. He was not an angel investor. He was a bankrupt fraud whose entire life was now legally owned by the sister he had spent 32 years treating like dirt. Ashley stared at me, her mouth hanging open. The smug, confident woman who had threatened to ruin my life on national television was entirely gone. She looked at Marcus, then looked at the glass walls of the boardroom, suddenly realizing she had just admitted to federal wire fraud in front of the chairman of a multinational conglomerate. "You cannot do this," Ashley stammered, her voice stripped of all its weaponized privilege. "You cannot just take their house. It is illegal." I looked at her with cold amusement. Actually, Ashley, it is entirely legal. Trayvon signed the commercial loan documents. Calvin and Brenda signed the collateral agreements. They defaulted on the terms 18 months ago. Apex Capital Holdings is simply exercising its legal right to seize the pledged assets to recover the stolen capital. Capital that you personally wired to the Cayman Islands. Trevin suddenly lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the mahogany table. "Corinne, please," he begged, his voice cracking in absolute desperation. "You cannot do this to Mom and Dad. They will have nowhere to go. They will be on the street. You have $80 million. You can just forgive the debt. You can just wipe it out. You are the managing director." I looked down at the brother who had sat in a steakhouse just 24 hours earlier, demanding $40 million from me with a forged napkin. "I am the managing director," I agreed, my voice perfectly level, "which means I have a fiduciary duty to recover stolen corporate funds. I do not forgive bad debts, Trevon, especially not debts created by a man who laughed in my face while his wife tried to extort me." Ashley took a step backward toward the heavy glass doors. Her eyes darted frantically around the room, looking for an escape route. "This is a family dispute," she said, her voice trembling. "I am leaving. I am calling my lawyer. You cannot hold me here." I did not move. I simply pressed a small silver button recessed into the surface of the conference table. "I am not holding you anywhere, Ashley," I said smoothly, "but you might want to wait a moment before calling your divorce attorney. You are going to need a different kind of legal representation today." Ashley frowned, reaching for the heavy brass door handle. "What are you talking about?" Before her fingers could touch the metal, the heavy glass doors swung open from the outside. Ashley stumbled backward, letting out a sharp gasp. Standing in the doorway, blocking the exit, were two men in dark, conservative suits. They did not look like corporate security. They had the rigid, uncompromising posture of federal law enforcement. Ashley Marie Sutton, the taller of the two men, said, pulling a leather badge wallet from his breast pocket and flipping it open. He did not ask it as a question. It was a statement of absolute fact. "We are special agents with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for your arrest." Ashley let out a high-pitched scream. "No!" she shrieked, backing away from the door and bumping into the conference table. "No, this is a mistake. I did not do anything. It was my husband. Trayvon ran the business. He signed the loans." The second agent stepped into the room, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. We have reviewed the financial forensic files provided by Apex Capital Holdings, Ms. Sutton. We have the routing numbers for the offshore accounts registered in your maiden name. We have the falsified vendor invoices. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Turn around and place your hands behind your back. Ashley began to hyperventilate, the reality of federal prison tearing through her manufactured reality. She turned to Trayvon, tears streaming down her face. Genuine, terrified tears. Trayvon, do something, she wailed, holding her hands out to him. Tell them it was your company. Tell them I was just doing what you told me to do. Please, Trayvon, you have to protect me. Trayvon stood frozen, staring at the woman who had just confessed to stealing $800,000 from him and planning to leave him bankrupt. He looked at the federal agents, then looked at his crying wife. He slowly took a step back, putting distance between himself and Ashley. I do not know anything about her offshore accounts, Trayvon said, his voice hollow and dead. She handled the books. She acted alone. Ashley let out a sound of pure animalistic rage. She lunged toward Trayvon, her manicured nails raised, but the federal agents moved with practiced efficiency. The taller agent grabbed her arm, twisting her around, while the second agent snapped the steel cuffs around her wrists. The sharp metallic click echoed violently in the pristine boardroom. Get your hands off me, Ashley screamed, struggling against their grip. Her carefully styled blonde hair fell into her face. You are hurting me. This is illegal. I am a victim here. My sister-in-law set me up. She is trying to ruin my life because she hates me. The agents ignored her frantic cries. They read her Miranda rights, in calm, monotonous voices, completely unaffected by her weaponized tears. They marched her toward the door, her expensive designer shoes dragging across the carpet. As they pulled her out into the executive hallway, Ashley twisted her head back to look at me. Her face was a mask of pure hatred. You are a monster, Corinne, she screamed, echoing the exact words she had used in the steakhouse. You are going to burn for this. I stood calmly at the table, watching the federal agents drag her toward the secure elevators. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I simply watched the inevitable consequences of her greed play out exactly as I had orchestrated. The heavy glass doors closed, silencing Ashley's screams. The boardroom was dead quiet again. Marcus Vance adjusted his tie, looking entirely unbothered by the federal arrest that had just occurred in his corporate suite. He picked up his phone and began typing an email, returning to business as usual. Trayvon was still staring at the closed doors. He looked like a man who had survived a car crash only to realize he was bleeding to death. He slowly turned to face me, his shoulders slumped, his entire posture defeated. Corinne, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please, I am begging you. Do not take the house. Mom and Dad have nothing else. If you take the estate, they will be ruined. The church will find out. They will be humiliated. I will do whatever you want. I will sign whatever papers you need. Just give me time to fix this. I picked up the financial dossier from the table and slid it into my tote bag. You cannot fix a $2 million deficit working at a car wash, Trayvon, I said, picking up my coat. And you are going to need a job because your real estate company is officially bankrupt. The assets are being liquidated to pay the remaining creditors. I walked around the mahogany table, stopping just a few feet from where he stood. You spent my entire life telling me I was worthless, I said, my voice quiet, but laced with absolute finality. You took my money, you mocked my ambition, and you stood by while your wife insulted my very existence. You convinced Mom and Dad to mortgage their history to fund your ego. You destroyed this family, Trayvon. Not me. I am simply the one handing you the bill. I walked past him toward the door. Corinne, he cried out, spinning around to follow me. What am I supposed to tell them? What am I supposed to tell Mom and Dad? I paused with my hand on the glass door. I did not look back at him. Tell them to start packing, I said, because the eviction notice is being posted on their front door on Monday morning, and tell them to find a new place to live by Friday. I pushed the door open and walked out, leaving the golden child standing alone in the ruins of his magnificent lie. The transition from the sterile quiet of the executive boardroom to the chaotic energy of the ground floor lobby was jarring. I stepped out of the private elevator flanked by my personal security detail. My phone was already buzzing with updates from my legal team confirming that Ashley had been successfully booked into federal custody and that the corporate public relations firm was already issuing a press release dismantling her defamatory social media video with hard financial facts. As I walked toward the revolving glass doors leading out to the street, a sudden commotion near the reception desk caught my attention. "I demand to see my daughter," a shrill, frantic voice echoed across the marble lobby. "You cannot keep us out of here. This is a family emergency." I stopped walking. My security detail immediately tightened their formation around me, but I raised a hand signaling them to stand down. Standing near the security turnstiles, arguing aggressively with the building guards, were Brenda and Calvin. They looked disheveled. Calvin was wearing a wrinkled golf shirt, and Brenda was clutching a leather handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. They must have seen Ashley's video and panicked, driving straight to the corporate headquarters to perform damage control. They probably thought they could use their parental authority to force me into writing a check and saving their precious reputation before the church congregation found out about the impending foreclosure. "Let them through," I told the head security guard. The guard stepped aside and Brenda immediately spotted me. She marched across the lobby, her heels clicking rapidly against the stone floor. Calvin followed close behind, looking anxious and out of place in the towering glass building. "Corinne," Brenda shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "What on earth is going on? We just saw Ashley being loaded into a federal vehicle outside the building. She was in handcuffs." "Corinne." "Handcuffs? What have you done?" "She committed federal wire fraud." "Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly calm as several employees stopped to watch the scene unfolding. "She stole $800,000 from Trevon's investors. The FBI arrested her. I had nothing to do with her criminal behavior. I simply provided the documentation to the authorities." Brenda stopped 3 feet away from me, her face twisting in pure horror. "She stole the money," she whispered, glancing back at Calvin. "But Trevon told us the business was just struggling with permits. He said he just needed a little more time to sell the properties." "Trevon lied to you," I stated plainly. "He lied to you to get you to sign over the grandmother's estate. His business was a failure from day one." Calvin stepped forward, his face a mask of desperation. "Corinne, you have to stop this. You have to fix this. If Ashley goes to prison, it will be a public scandal. The entire church will know. The deacons will ask questions. Our reputation will be completely destroyed. You have the money, Corinne. You can pay back the investors. You can make the charges go away. You have to protect your brother's wife." I stared at the man who had called me a punishment from God just a few years earlier. He was entirely unfazed by the fact that his daughter-in-law had committed a federal crime. He was unfazed that his son had lied to him. His only concern was the fragile illusion of his social status within a church community that only respected him for the wealth he pretended to have. "I cannot make federal charges disappear, Dad," I said coldly. "And even if I could, I would not spend a single cent to protect a woman who spent the last 3 years calling me aggressive and worthless." Brenda suddenly lunged forward. Before my security team could react, she raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack echoed through the lobby. Several people gasped. My security detail immediately grabbed Brenda's arms, pulling her back, but I held up my hand, stopping them from removing her from the building. My cheek burned. The physical sting was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the absolute clarity that washed over me in that moment. Any lingering shred of familial obligation, any tiny remaining whisper of a daughter seeking her mother's approval died instantly. "How could you?" Brenda screamed, struggling against the security guard's grip. "How could you send the police after your own family? You are a cold, heartless girl. You are destroying our reputation. We sacrificed everything to build a name in this community, and you are tearing it down out of pure spite. You are a disgrace to this family, Corinne." I slowly turned my head back to look at her. I did not touch my cheek. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her with eyes so cold she stopped struggling against the guards. "You care about your reputation in the church, Mom?" I asked. my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. You care what the Deacons think about your perfect family. Brenda swallowed hard, suddenly looking uncertain. We have a standing in the community, she stammered. We are respected. I nodded slowly. Enjoy that respect today, Brenda. Soak it in, because you are going to need it on Sunday. Calvin frowned, stepping closer. What are you talking about, Corinne? What happens on Sunday? I looked right past him, focusing entirely on the woman who had just struck me in the lobby of my own company. I am executing the foreclosure on the grandmother's estate on Friday morning, I said, articulating every word with absolute precision. I am taking the house. I am taking the land. And I am taking the home you live in. But I am not doing it quietly. I will see you at Sunday service, Mom. I am going to stand at the pulpit and tell your entire congregation exactly how you financed your golden child's failures. Brenda gasped, all the remaining color draining from her face. You would not dare, she whispered, her voice shaking with genuine terror. You would not humiliate us in front of the pastor. I smiled. It was the same smile Traven had used when he thought he owned $40 million of my life. You made me the villain of this family, I said softly. I think it is time I finally start playing the part. I turned my back on them and walked out the glass doors, leaving them to face the absolute destruction of everything they valued most. The silence in the private dining room was heavy and suffocating following his threat. I stared at him across the table, watching the absolute delusion settle over his features. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket with a smug, triumphant smile. He pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen a few times with a manicured finger. He slid the device across the white tablecloth, stopping it right next to my crystal water glass. Look at it, Corinne, he commanded, his voice dripping with unearned authority. I looked down at the bright screen illuminating the dim space. It was a photograph of a stained cocktail napkin from a cheap diner. Written in faded blue ink was a crude sentence stating I received $500 from Trayvon to be used as seed money for my business. At the bottom was a signature that looked vaguely like mine from years ago. Brenda leaned over the table to look at the screen, her eyes wide with a sickening mix of relief and greed. She let out a soft gasp and placed a hand over her heart. It is right there in writing, she said, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. He was your first investor, Corinne. He believed in you when no one else did. He gave you the foundation you needed to build your little computer project. Calvin adjusted his posture, sitting up straight and tall in his heavy leather chair. He folded his large hands together, resting them on the edge of the table. Your mother is exactly right, Corinne, Calvin said, his voice carrying the deep, resonant tone he used during his Sunday sermons. A contract is a contract before God and the law. We are a family of our word. You need to do what is honorable here in the eyes of the Lord. Give your brother his $40 million. He is the man of his house. He is building the family legacy. He is the one establishing the Blackwell name in the real estate world. You are just a single woman. You do not need that kind of money. It would only confuse you and lead you astray from the humble path you are meant to walk. I sat perfectly still. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not act like the emotional, irrational woman they desperately wanted me to be. I simply looked at the three of them, realizing they were completely willing to strip me of everything I had worked for just to feed Trayvon's endless ego. I thought back to the darkest days of my journey, the days they conveniently ignored. When I was sleeping in my Honda Civic during my finals because I could not make rent, you took Trayvon to Cabo for his birthday. I stated, my voice perfectly level, cutting through their self-righteous posturing. You sat back and watched me starve in library parking lots while you funded his lavish resort vacations. You ignored my calls when my electricity was shut off, but you bought him a new car when he wrecked his third one. You made this bed. Sleep in it. I reached down into my structured designer tote bag resting by my feet. I opened the main compartment and pulled out a sleek black leather folder. I unclasped it and extracted a heavy bank-certified document printed on official watermarked paper. I slid it across the table, pushing Trayvon's phone out of the way with the edge of the document. Read it, Trayvon Y instructed, keeping my gaze locked on his face. He frowned, picking up the heavy paper with sudden hesitation. It was a certified financial record from 7 years ago, retrieved directly from the bank archives. It clearly showed a wire transfer of $600 from my business account directly into Trayvon's personal checking account. The memo line was highlighted in bright yellow marker. It read, "Repayment of $500 personal loan, plus 20% interest in full and final satisfaction of all debts and claims." Right below that was the official bank stamp showing Trayvon had personally endorsed and cashed the check. "I repaid you exactly 3 months after you gave me that money, Trayvon," I said, watching the color rapidly drain from his face. "I starved myself to pay your extortionate interest rate. By cashing that check with that specific legal designation, you formally accepted the terms of repayment. You legally dissolved any claim of equity you thought you had in my company. You are not a founder. You are not an angel investor. You are a predator who tried to exploit his own sister and failed miserably. You do not own a single line of code in my software. You do not own a single penny of my $80 million. The reality of the document hit the table like a physical blow. Trayvon dropped the paper as if it burned his fingers. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out as his $40 million fantasy evaporated into thin air. He looked at Calvin for help, but Calvin was staring at the bank stamp in defeated silence. That was the moment Ashley decided she could not remain silent any longer. The prospect of losing the immense wealth she felt entitled to broke her carefully cultivated facade of Southern charm. She stood up so abruptly, her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the polished floor. Several heads turned in the restaurant, but she did not care. "You people are all the same," Ashley yelled, her face turning an ugly mottled shade of red. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. "So incredibly greedy and selfish. You sit there, acting like you are better than everyone else while your own brother breaks his back to provide for this entire family." Ashley leaned over the table, her tennis bracelet glittering under the chandelier. "Trayvon deserves that money, Corinne," she spat, her voice echoing in the quiet dining room. "His real estate empire is the only thing keeping this family afloat. He works day and night negotiating deals and building luxury properties while you just hide behind a computer screen playing with spreadsheets. You owe him everything. His business is saving this family, and you are just a bitter, aggressive woman trying to steal from your own blood." I looked at Ashley standing there in her designer dress, wearing expensive jewelry bought with stolen money. A cold laugh escaped my lips. It was a harsh, brittle sound that made my parents flinch in their seats. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the white tablecloth. Keeping the family afloat, I repeated slowly, letting the absolute absurdity of her statement fill the room. I looked from Ashley to Trayvon. Trayvon's eyes widened in sudden sheer panic. He shook his head slightly, silently begging me to stop. He knew exactly what was coming. But I was entirely done protecting the fragile egos of the people who had spent my whole life trying to destroy me. "Ashley," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly whisper that carried across the table, "Trayvon has not sold a single house in 3 years. His real estate empire is a complete sham. It is nothing but a shell company used to funnel money into his personal accounts so he can play golf and pretend to be an executive at the country club." Ashley froze, staring at me. Her hand dropped slowly to her side. "That is a lie," she whispered, gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles turned white. "We have residential developments. We have eager investors. We are building luxury communities." "You have predatory loans," I corrected her, my voice slicing through her pathetic delusion with surgical precision. "Your husband took out a massive mezzanine loan from a private equity firm in New York 2 years ago to fund a luxury development project that never even broke ground. He took the capital and spent it all on luxury cars, exotic vacations, and designer watches to maintain the illusion of wealth for you and his friends. He has zero assets. He has zero revenue stream. He is currently $2 million in debt. He has completely defaulted on the interest payments for 18 consecutive months. He is entirely and irrevocably bankrupt. Ashley slowly turned her head to look at Trayvon. Her eyes were wide with unadulterated horror. Trayvon could not look at her. He stared down at his half-eaten dry-aged steak, his face pale and shining with cold sweat. He looked like a man standing on the gallows waiting for the lever to be pulled. Ashley's mouth trembled as the reality of her fake, luxurious life crashed down around her. $2 million, she breathed out, stepping away from the table, as if her husband had suddenly caught a contagious disease. But the true devastation was not happening with Ashley. The real nightmare was unfolding at the head of the table. Brenda let out a sharp, gasping breath. Her hands flew up to clutch her chest as she began to hyperventilate. The expensive fabric of her blouse crinkled under her desperate grip. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she slumped heavily against the tufted leather booth, struggling to pull air into her lungs. Calvin turned a sickly, ashen shade of gray. The powerful, confident patriarch who had demanded my money moments ago vanished instantly, leaving behind a terrified, broken old man. His large hands began shaking violently where they rested on the white tablecloth, making the silverware rattle against the porcelain plates. "Corinne." Calvin stammered, his voice weak and completely unrecognizable. It was the sound of absolute despair. "We—" Calvin choked on the words, unable to force them past his lips. "We put the family house up." He squeezed his eyes shut as thick tears began leaking out onto his weathered cheeks. "We put the family house and your grandmother's historic estate up as collateral for his $2 million loan. They are foreclosing next Friday." Sunday morning arrived with a crisp breeze that felt entirely too clean for the filth my family was trying to hide. The sanctuary of Greater Zion Fellowship was a magnificent spectacle of modern religious architecture. It held 3,000 people and featured state-of-the-art lighting, massive projection screens, and a choir that rivaled any professional vocal group in the country. This was where my parents derived all their power. It was their kingdom. It was the place where they paraded their manufactured perfection to an audience of affluent African-American professionals who worshipped success just as much as they worshipped God. I arrived deliberately late, waiting until the praise and worship segment was concluding and the transition to the morning announcements began. I slipped through the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the sanctuary just as Pastor Miller took his position behind the clear acrylic pulpit. The air in the room was thick with the scent of expensive perfumes and the rustle of silk dresses. I could see them sitting in their reserved seats in the very first row, right in the center. Calvin was wearing his finest custom-tailored suit, his posture rigid and proud. He looked like the epitome of a distinguished church elder, unbothered by the fact that he was financially ruined. Brenda sat beside him in an extravagant wide-brimmed hat and a vibrant floral dress, looking the picture of a devoted holy woman. Next to her sat Trayvon. He was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet with a fabricated expression of deep mourning. He was playing the role of the devastated husband whose wife had been unjustly torn away from him by a cruel system. It was a sickening performance. They were actually sitting in the house of God, pretending everything was perfect while their entire lives burned to the ground. I started down the long center aisle. The carpet was thick and plush, muffling my footsteps, but my presence did not go unnoticed. Heads began to turn. Whispers rippled through the wooden pews as people recognized me. The news of my $80 million company sale had already circulated through the congregation via social media and Sunday morning gossip. I wore a tailored crimson power suit, a deliberate contrast to the sea of subdued pastels and dark traditional suits. I did not look away. I kept my head high and my eyes locked on the pulpit. The head usher, a stern man named Brother Davis, stepped out into the aisle to intercept me, holding up a white-gloved hand. But Pastor Miller saw me approaching. His eyes widened slightly, but a massive, greedy smile quickly spread across his face. He signaled to Brother Davis, waving him off with a quick flick of his wrist. Pastor Miller raised both his hands to the congregation. "Church family, we have a very special guest joining us this morning." Pastor Miller boomed his voice, echoing through the massive sound system and bouncing off the vaulted ceilings. Sister Corinne has returned to us today completely blessed and highly favored. I am sure you have all heard the incredible news of her monumental business success this past week. God is truly moving in this family. God is pouring out generational wealth. Let us welcome her to the altar. I reached the altar stairs and walked up them without a single second of hesitation. Brenda turned around in her seat. The smug, holy expression on her face instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She grabbed Calvin's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into his expensive suit jacket. Calvin stared up at me, his jaw tight, his eyes silently pleading with me not to do this. Trayvon looked like he wanted to sink into the floorboards and disappear entirely. Pastor Miller stepped aside, offering me the microphone with a gracious, eager bow. He clearly expected me to hand over a massive tithe right there on the spot. I took the heavy microphone, feeling the cool metal against my palm. I looked out over the 3,000 faces staring back at me. They were waiting for a testimony. They were waiting to hear how faith and obedience to my parents had brought me untold wealth. I intended to give them a testimony, but it was not the one they were expecting. "Good morning, church," I said, my voice steady and clear, filling the cavernous room. "I want to thank Pastor Miller for allowing me this time. God has indeed blessed me this week. I recently sold my healthcare data company to a major conglomerate for $80 million. A collective gasp followed by thunderous applause erupted from the congregation. People stood up in the pews, cheering and waving their hands in praise. I waited for the noise to die down. Brenda stood up, raising her hands to the heavens, acting the part of the proud mother, her face plastered with a fake beaming smile, even as her eyes darted nervously in my direction. "When you receive a harvest of this magnitude, it is your fundamental duty to give back," I continued, keeping my eyes locked on my mother. "Which is why I am announcing a direct donation of $1 million to the Greater Zion Youth and Education Fund, effective immediately." The church went absolutely wild. The choir members jumped to their feet. Pastor Miller let out a loud shout of praise, grabbing a white towel from the pulpit to wipe the sudden sweat from his forehead. Calvin stood up, clapping his hands slowly, trying to project an image of calm, fatherly pride, but I could see the visible tremor in his fingers. Trayvon remained seated, staring at his shoes. But with great blessings comes a great responsibility to walk in absolute truth, I said, my voice suddenly shifting, taking on a darker, more serious tone that cut through the celebration like a knife. The cheering slowly began to fade as the congregation sensed the sudden change in the atmosphere. People sat back down, their attention completely riveted to the altar. The silence became thick and anticipatory. And the truth is, the foundation of my family has been built on lies, extortion, and deception. Pastor Miller stopped wiping his forehead. He looked at me nervously, unsure if this was still part of a spiritual testimony, or if something had gone terribly wrong. Brenda dropped her hands to her sides, her mouth opening in silent horror. "My brother Trayvon is sitting right here in the front row," I said, gesturing directly at him with my free hand. "He is playing the part of the grieving, wounded husband today, after his wife Ashley was arrested by the FBI on Friday afternoon for federal wire fraud and massive embezzlement." A shockwave rolled through the sanctuary. 3,000 people inhaled sharply at the exact same time. The silence that followed was so profound you could hear the soft humming of the stage lights. Trayvon has spent the last 3 years parading around this church, acting like a highly successful real estate developer. I continued, stepping out from behind the acrylic pulpit, so there was absolutely nothing between me and my family. He has taken the praise and the respect of this community while looking down on anyone who actually worked for a living. But his real estate empire is a complete and total sham. It is a bankrupt shell company. He has not sold a single home in 3 years. He is $2 million in debt to a predatory private equity firm in New York, and he has not made a single payment in 18 months. Whispers began to erupt all over the room, the low murmur of pure scandal. People were leaning over the pews, pointing at Trayvon, who was now shrinking down in his seat, completely paralyzed by the brutal public exposure. Calvin stood up, his face dark with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. "Corinne, that is enough," Calvin commanded, his voice booming out over the crowd without a microphone. "This is a house of worship. You are completely out of line. Step down from that altar immediately." I did not move an inch. I looked down at the man who had demanded I hand over $40 million just to protect his fragile ego. "I am not finished, Dad," I said directly into the microphone, ensuring every single person in the building heard me loud and clear. "Because the congregation needs to know exactly how you financed your son's fraudulent lifestyle." Brenda let out a shrill, piercing cry. She stumbled out of her row and into the center aisle, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me. "You are a liar," Brenda screamed, her voice echoing wildly off the vaulted ceilings. "The devil is using you to attack this blessed family. Do not listen to her, Pastor. She is filled with hate and jealousy because she has no husband. She is a bitter, aggressive woman." Pastor Miller stepped forward, reaching a hand out as if to take the microphone away from me. "Sister Corinne, perhaps we should take this discussion to my private office," Pastor Miller suggested, his voice tight with extreme anxiety over the scandalous scene unfolding on his stage. "We are staying right here, Pastor," I said, sidestepping him smoothly to maintain my position. "Because my parents, Calvin and Brenda, respected elders of this very church, quietly mortgaged their own home to secure a $2 million loan for Trayvon. But that was not enough for the private equity firm. The underwriters needed far more collateral. So my parents pledged my grandmother's historic estate. They put 20 acres of our family history, our legacy, up for a loan they knew they could never repay." Gasps of genuine horror swept through the older members of the congregation. The grandmother's estate was well known in the local community. It was a symbol of triumph and endurance through decades of hardship. The fact that Calvin and Brenda had gambled it away on a fake business was an unforgivable sin in the eyes of their peers. And because Trayvon has completely defaulted on his payments, I continued relentlessly driving the final nail into their pristine reputation. The private equity firm activated the default clauses. They are foreclosing on everything. The family home and the historic estate are being seized this coming Friday. My parents are completely bankrupt, and they will be entirely homeless by the end of the week. The entire church erupted into sheer chaos. People were shouting questions, murmuring in absolute disbelief, and staring at Calvin and Brenda as if they had never known them at all. Trayvon stood up, turning to face the crowd, holding his hands up defensively. "It is a lie," Trayvon yelled, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. "She is making it all up because she does not want to share her wealth with her own blood. She is trying to ruin us because she is selfish." Brenda rushed toward the altar, her face streaked with mascara and tears, trying to climb the steps. "Someone stop her!" Brenda shrieked. "She is a monster! She is destroying the family legacy!" Calvin grabbed Brenda's arm, pulling her back down, but he looked utterly defeated. The congregation was officially turning on them. The profound respect they had spent decades cultivating was dissolving into dust right before their eyes. But I was not done. I had saved the absolute worst reality for last. I reached into the breast pocket of my crimson suit jacket and pulled out a folded legal document. Pastor Miller was frantically signaling for the sound engineers to cut my microphone, but I turned directly to him, holding out the heavy papers. "Pastor," I said, my voice ringing with absolute authority, "do not cut this mic until you read this." I thrust the document directly into his hands. Pastor Miller hesitated, looking down at the legal paper. His hands were shaking. "Read page 4. Pastor, I commanded, pointing at the document. "Read the secondary guarantor clause." Pastor Miller flipped past the first 3 pages. He scanned the dense legal text on page 4. I watched his eyes move rapidly across the lines. I watched his brow furrow in deep confusion. And then I watched the exact moment his heart seemed to stop beating. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost staring at a fresh grave. He looked up from the paper, his mouth hanging open in absolute shock. He stared at Calvin with a look of pure betrayal and terror. "What did they do?" "Pastor," I asked, holding the microphone close to my mouth so everyone in the enormous room could hear the question. What did my holy righteous parents do to get that $2 million loan when the grandmother's estate was not quite enough collateral? Pastor Miller began to tremble. He clutched the document to his chest as if it were physically burning him. Calvin let out a guttural, hollow sound of defeat, falling back into his seat and burying his face entirely in his hands. Brenda stopped screaming in the aisle and froze completely motionless. To get that $2 million loan, I said, addressing the dead silent congregation. Mom and Dad did not just use the estate. I turned my icy gaze down to my mother, who was standing paralyzed in the aisle. They forged your signature, Pastor. They forged your name on the corporate documents and used the Greater Zion Building Fund as a secondary guarantor for Trayvon's debt. The heavy acrylic microphone hit the polished wooden stage with a deafening thud. Pastor Miller did not even flinch at the sound. His eyes remained locked on my father. The look of sheer betrayal and righteous fury on the pastor's face was something I will never forget. He held the legal document up his hands, shaking so violently the heavy paper rattled. "You stole from the house of the Lord," Pastor Miller whispered into the sudden dead silence of the sanctuary. "You stole from the congregation to fund your son's greed." That single sentence broke the spell. The massive sanctuary completely erupted. 3,000 people began shouting all at once. The noise was a physical force crashing against the walls of the megachurch. Women in the front rows were pointing and screaming. Men were jumping over the wooden pews, demanding answers. The very community my parents had sacrificed my childhood and my mental health to impress was now tearing them apart like a pack of starving wolves. All the prestigious social standing, all the carefully curated respect, vanished into thin air. They were no longer the blessed elders of Greater Zion Fellowship. They were common thieves who had robbed their own community. Brenda looked out at the sea of furious faces. The women she played bridge with, the women she gossiped with, were now shouting her name with absolute disgust. The weight of her total social destruction finally hit her. She let out a weak, shallow gasp. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed hard against the carpeted floor of the center aisle. This time, there was no manufactured drama. This time, it was not a calculated performance to gain sympathy. She actually fainted cold. Calvin did not even reach down to help her. He was too busy backing away from the angry church elders who were advancing on him from the choir stand. I looked past my parents to find Trayvon. The golden child, the supposed real estate mogul, was currently demonstrating his true nature. While his mother lay unconscious on the floor and his father was backed into a corner, Trayvon was trying to sneak away. He slipped out of the front pew, keeping his head down, and scurried toward the side exit door near the baptismal pool. He thought he could just abandon his parents and escape the consequences of his own fraud. But the church deacons were faster. Brother Davis and 3 other massively built men stepped in front of the heavy wooden doors, blocking the exit completely. They crossed their arms and glared down at my brother. "Where do you think you are going, son?" Brother Davis asked, his voice booming over the chaos. "You are going to sit right back down and wait for the authorities to arrive." Trayvon literally shrank back, his shoulders dropping, his entire body shaking with fear. He looked around the sanctuary like a trapped rat, but there was no way out. The golden boy had finally run out of places to hide. I did not stay to watch the police arrive. I turned my back on the screaming congregation and walked out the side door into the bright Sunday morning sunlight. The air felt incredibly clean. For the first time in 32 years, my chest did not feel tight with the burden of my family expectations. I got into my waiting town car and told my driver to take me home. The Sunday service showdown was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. Monday morning arrived with a cold gray drizzle that perfectly matched the reality my family was about to face. I sat at the massive marble island in my luxury penthouse, sipping hot black coffee and watching the local news on the flat-screen television. The church scandal was the lead story. The news anchor detailed the fraudulent loan and the embezzlement of church funds. My parents' faces were splashed across the screen, followed by footage of Ashley being escorted into a federal courthouse. It was a complete public relations nightmare for them, but my legal team had ensured my name and my company remained entirely insulated from their criminal behavior. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, my legal team initiated the final phase of the corporate guillotine. Process servers simultaneously arrived at the gates of my grandmother's historic estate and the front door of my parents' sprawling suburban mansion. They carried thick manila envelopes containing the official eviction notices. Because the private equity firm holding their $2 million debt was a direct subsidiary of the conglomerate I now managed, I had full executive control over the timeline. There would be no extensions, there would be no grace periods, there would be no negotiations. The legal documents clearly stated that Calvin, Brenda, and Trayvon had exactly 48 hours to completely vacate both properties. The assets were being officially seized to cover the massive fraudulent debts they had accumulated. They were losing the land our ancestors had fought for. They were losing the mansion they used to show off to their friends. They were losing everything they valued most in the world because they valued money more than they valued their own daughter. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling absolutely no remorse. I had offered them a chance to be a real family. I had offered them the truth. They chose Trayvon's lies every single time. They chose to mortgage their history to fund his ego. They made their bed, and now they were going to sleep in it. My phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was a call from the head concierge downstairs in the lobby of my high-security building. I answered it, keeping my voice professional. "Miss Corinne," the concierge said, sounding stressed. "I am so sorry to disturb you, but a man claiming to be your brother bypassed the outer security gate behind a delivery truck. He is in the private elevator heading up to your penthouse right now. We have security on the way up to intercept him." I set my coffee mug down. "Tell security to stand down," I instructed calmly. "Let him off the elevator. I will handle it." Less than a minute later, the heavy mahogany doors of my penthouse burst open. Trayvon stumbled into my entryway, and the sight of him was almost jarring. The impeccably groomed, arrogant businessman from the steakhouse was entirely gone. His expensive designer suit was heavily wrinkled and stained with coffee. He had not shaved, and his eyes were bloodshot and frantic. He smelled faintly of cheap alcohol and sheer panic. He looked around my pristine, minimalist living room, taking in the floor-to-ceiling windows and the expensive modern art on the walls. The contrast between my success and his total failure was undeniable. "Corinne," he gasped out, his voice hoarse and desperate. He rushed forward, crossing the wide expanse of the living room until he was standing just a few feet away from my kitchen island. He did not yell. He did not demand. Instead, he did something I never thought I would see in my entire lifetime. Trayvon, the proud, arrogant golden child, dropped to his knees on my imported hardwood floor. "Please, Corinne," he sobbed, throwing his hands out toward me. Real tears were streaming down his face, dripping onto his wrinkled suit jacket. "You have to help me. They froze all my bank accounts. Ashley is in federal custody, and her lawyers are trying to blame everything on me. The church is pressing charges against Mom and Dad. The eviction notices came this morning. I have absolutely nothing, Corinne. I have nowhere to go. I do not even have money for a hotel room." I looked down at him, resting my elbows on the cool marble counter. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt exactly nothing. "You are a millionaire, Corinne," he begged, wiping his nose with the back of his trembling hand. "You have $80 million. You can fix all of this with one phone call. You can pay the private equity firm. You can hire the best defense lawyers for me. You can save the family. We are blood, Corinne. You cannot just let me rot in the street." I tilted my head, studying his pathetic display. "You want me to save you, Trayvon?" I asked softly. "After you tried to steal $40 million from me, after you sat in a restaurant and told me I owed you my entire company because of a $500 loan?" Trayvon shook his head violently, his eyes wide and frantic. "That was Ashley," he cried out completely, throwing his wife to the wolves to save his own skin. "It was all her idea, Corinne. She is greedy. She manipulated me. She told me we deserved your money because we were struggling. I never wanted to take your company. I swear to God, Corinne, it was all her doing. And Mom and Dad, they pushed me. They forced me to take out that massive loan because they wanted me to be as successful as you. They put too much pressure on me. It is their fault the grandmother's estate is gone. They signed the papers. I was just trying to make them proud. I stared at him, letting the absolute disgust wash over me. He was completely incapable of taking any accountability. Even now, kneeling on my floor with his life in ruins, he refused to admit he was the problem. He blamed his wife. He blamed his parents. He was a coward down to his very core. A weak, pathetic man who destroyed everything he touched and demanded everyone else clean up the mess. You are exactly the man I always knew you were, Trevon. I said, my voice dropping to a cold, unforgiving register. You are a fraud and a coward. You built your entire life on lies, and now you want me to buy you a new one. Please, Corinne, he wailed, bringing his hands together in a prayer motion. Just $1 million. Just enough to get me out of the state and start over. I will never bother you again. I will disappear. You will never have to see my face. Just help your brother one last time. I looked at him kneeling there, sobbing on my floor. I remembered all the times he had mocked my clothes when we were teenagers. I remembered him laughing at my business plan. I remembered him charging me 20% interest when I was starving and desperate. I remembered Ashley sneering at my computer hobby while he smirked in agreement. I slowly turned around and walked over to the small decorative bowl I kept near the entryway console. I reached inside and my fingers brushed against cold metal. I picked up the object and walked back to the kitchen island standing directly above my weeping brother. You know, Trevon? I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. I have been thinking a lot about our history this weekend. I have been thinking about what I actually owe you. And you are right. You are my brother. I cannot just let you sleep on the street. Trevon's head snapped up. His bloodshot eyes widened with sudden, desperate hope. He let out a wet, gasping laugh, wiping his face furiously. Oh, thank God, he breathed out. Thank you, Corinne. Thank you. I knew you would not abandon me. I knew you had a good heart. Where are you putting me up? Do you have a spare condo? Is it a hotel? How much are you giving me? I did not answer his rapid-fire questions. Instead, I lifted my hand and placed the object I was holding onto the smooth marble surface of the island. I pushed it forward with one finger. The object slid across the counter, making a soft, metallic scraping sound, until it stopped right at the edge, directly in front of Trevon's face. Trevon stared at the object. The hopeful, desperate smile slowly melted right off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. It was a single silver car key attached to a faded, frayed black lanyard. What is this? Trevon asked, his voice trembling as he looked up at me. I found a place for you to live, Trevon, I said, a slow, icy smile spreading across my face. It is not a penthouse, and it is not a luxury hotel, but it is exactly what you deserve. Trevon swallowed hard, his eyes darting back down to the key, where he asked, his voice barely a whisper. My old 2008 Honda Civic, I replied, my smile widening as the absolute horror dawned in his eyes. The exact same car I slept in during my college finals because you and our parents refused to help me. I kept it in storage all these years as a reminder of where I came from. I had it brought out and parked in the visitor lot downstairs this morning. Trevon's mouth opened in a silent scream of disbelief. The back seat folds down so you can stretch your legs out. I continued, ruthlessly driving the blade all the way in. It gets very cold at night, so I suggest you find some thick blankets before the sun goes down. The eviction from your house is final in 48 hours, and you have zero cash to your name. You have the keys now, Trevon. I suggest you go claim your new real estate empire before they tow it. Good luck. Friday morning broke with a harsh, bright sunlight that offered no warmth or comfort to the people scrambling across the lawn. I stood at the end of the long, winding driveway of my grandmother's historic estate, holding a sleek silver clipboard. Behind me were 4 massive black SUVs and a dozen private security contractors wearing tactical gear and earpieces. Across the perfectly manicured grass sat the sprawling colonial mansion my parents had lived in like absolute royalty for the past 10 years. A bright yellow moving truck was backed up to the grand front doors. It was a cheap discount rental truck because my parents' credit cards were entirely frozen and they could not afford professional movers. The affluent neighborhood was wide awake and watching the spectacle. The wealthy doctors and lawyers who lived in the adjacent estates were standing on their sprawling porches, holding their morning coffees, and pointing at the absolute destruction of the Blackwell family reputation. The very community my parents had sacrificed my childhood and my mental health to impress had now completely turned their backs on them. The church scandal had been front-page news all week, and the affluent neighbors were treating my parents like a contagious disease. I walked up the brick pathway, my heels clicking sharply against the stone. I stepped through the open double doors and into the grand foyer. The house was in utter chaos. The pristine illusion of my mother's perfect life was dismantled into stacks of cheap brown cardboard boxes. Calvin was struggling to carry a heavy mahogany side table, his face red and slick with sweat. His expensive tailored suits were packed away, and he was wearing a faded polo shirt that clung to his slumped, exhausted shoulders. He looked exactly like what he was, a broken old man who had gambled his family legacy on a lie and lost everything. He stumbled slightly under the weight of the table and leaned against the wall, gasping for air. Brenda was frantically wrapping her imported crystal glasses in old newspaper. Her hands were shaking so badly, she dropped a goblet and it shattered violently against the marble floor. She let out a pathetic wail and fell to her knees, trying to gather the sharp, glittering pieces. She was wearing a stained tracksuit, a far cry from the elegant floral dresses she usually paraded around in. I stood in the entryway watching them. I checked off a box on my clipboard. The security guards spread out through the ground floor, ensuring nothing belonging to the actual estate was taken. Only personal items were allowed in the boxes. Brenda looked up from the broken glass and saw me standing there. The sight of me calm and entirely in control shattered the last remaining piece of her fragile sanity. She scrambled to her feet, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "How can you just stand there and watch us suffer?" Brenda screamed, her voice echoing off the high ceilings and out the open front doors for all the neighbors to hear. "You are a cold-blooded monster, Corinne. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I gave you life. I fed you and clothed you and put a roof over your head. You owe me everything you have. You owe me respect and obedience, and you are throwing us out into the street like garbage." I did not yell back. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I looked at a large cardboard box, resting near her feet, labeled luxury shoes. "I do not owe you a single thing, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly level, cutting through her hysteria like a scalpel. "Because you never acted like a mother to me. You acted like a bank robber who lived in my house." Brenda gasped, taking a step back. "What are you talking about?" she stammered. I pointed my pen at the box of shoes. "I remember being 16 years old," I said, stepping closer to her. "I remember working weekend shifts at the grocery store, saving every single penny I earned in a pink ceramic piggy bank hidden in the back of my closet. I was saving for a used laptop so I could teach myself how to code. I worked for 6 months to save $400, and then one morning I woke up and the piggy bank was shattered on the floor and the money was entirely gone." Calvin stopped moving, looking over at Brenda with a deep frown. "You told me we had a break-in?" I continued, staring directly into my mother's terrified eyes. "You called the police and filed a fake report saying a burglar climbed through my window. You let me sleep in fear for months, thinking someone had been in my room. But 2 days later, Traven walked into the kitchen wearing a brand new pair of limited edition Air Jordans that cost exactly $400. When I asked him how he got them, he laughed and said his amazing mother bought them for him because he scored a touchdown in a practice game." Brenda swallowed hard, her face turning the color of chalk. "That was a long time ago," she whispered. "He needed those shoes for his social standing at school. He needed sneakers more than I needed a future," I summarized, writing another checkmark on my clipboard. "That is exactly who you are, Mom. Every single box you pack today represents a moment you chose him over me. You sold my future to buy his present, and now I am simply collecting the debt. Two security guards walked past us carrying a heavy velvet armchair. I watched them load it into the yellow truck. I looked at the grand staircase where I used to sit and listen to their dinner parties. I remember when my high school car broke down, I said, my voice echoing in the empty hall. I needed a new transmission so I could drive to my community college classes. I begged you for a loan. You told me the family was going through a tight financial period and you could not spare a single dime. You told me I needed to learn how to walk and take the public bus to build character. But the very next morning, a flatbed truck pulled into this exact driveway and dropped off a brand new BMW sports car for Trevon. You bought it for him because he complained that his old car did not look prestigious enough for his fraternity brothers. Calvin stared at the floor, entirely unable to defend his actions. Brenda clutched a crumpled piece of newspaper to her chest, trembling visibly. Every single item going into that discount truck was paid for with my suffering, I said, taking a step closer to Brenda so she could see the absolute finality in my eyes. You starved my ambition to feed his ego. You crushed my self-esteem to build his false confidence. You created the monster that bankrupted this family. I am just the one handing you the bill. You have 2 hours left to vacate the premises before my security team physically removes you. I suggest you pack faster. I turned away from them and walked toward the grand staircase. My head of security, a tall, imposing man named Marcus, met me on the landing. His earpiece buzzed quietly. Miss Corinne, Marcus said, his voice low and professional. My men were doing the final sweep of the upper floors to ensure no structural fixtures were being removed. They found something unusual in the attic. I frowned, looking up the winding stairs. What kind of unusual, I asked. It looks like a hidden compartment behind the false wall in the cedar closet, Marcus replied. There is a heavy steel safe bolted directly to the floor joists. It is locked, and your parents did not declare it on the asset seizure forms. My eyes narrowed. The grandmother's estate was massive and filled with secret alcoves from its historic construction, but a modern steel safe bolted to the floor was not part of the original architecture. My parents were hiding something valuable enough to keep completely off the legal records. Bring my father up to the attic, I instructed Marcus. Do whatever it takes to get him up there. I walked up the 3 flights of stairs, stepping carefully over discarded trash bags and piles of clothes they had decided not to pack. The air in the attic was thick with dust and the smell of old cedar wood. 3 security guards were standing in the far corner, shining heavy-duty flashlights into a dark alcove behind a removed wooden panel. I walked over and looked inside. Nestled perfectly between the heavy wooden support beams was a solid black combination safe. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, indicating it had not been opened in quite some time. A few moments later, Marcus appeared at the top of the stairs, holding Calvin by the arm. Calvin was panting heavily, his face pale and slick with sweat. He stumbled into the dusty attic, looking around with wide, terrified eyes. "What is this?" Calvin demanded, trying to pull his arm away from Marcus. "You have no right to drag me up here. I am packing my belongings." I pointed to the dark alcove. "Open it, Dad," I said. Calvin looked toward the false wall, and his entire body seemed to freeze. All the fight instantly drained out of him. His knees buckled slightly, and Marcus had to hold him up by his faded polo shirt to keep him from collapsing onto the dusty floorboards. "I do not know the combination," Calvin whispered, his voice shaking so badly the words were barely understandable. "It belonged to your grandmother. She never gave us the code. We just left it there when she passed." I stared at him, seeing right through the pathetic lie. "You are a terrible liar, Dad," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "That safe is a modern digital model manufactured within the last 5 years. Grandmother passed away 8 years ago. You put that safe there, and you are going to open it right now, or I am calling the federal authorities who just arrested your daughter-in-law and telling them you are hiding undisclosed assets during a corporate foreclosure." Calvin let out a choked sob. He looked at the security guards and then looked at the cold, unyielding expression on my face. He knew he was entirely trapped. There was no pastor to save him here. There was no congregation to manipulate. There was only the harsh reality of the law. He slowly walked forward, his heavy shoes dragging across the floorboards. He knelt down in the dust in front of the alcove. His large hands were trembling so violently he could barely press the buttons on the digital keypad. He punched in a 6-digit sequence. It was Trayvon's birth date. The lock clicked, and the heavy steel door popped open. "Step back," I commanded. Calvin scrambled backward, pressing his back against the slanted attic wall and burying his face in his hands. He began to weep silently, his shoulders shaking with the weight of whatever he had been hiding. I walked forward and pulled the heavy steel door wide open. Marcus shined his tactical flashlight directly into the dark interior of the safe. It was not filled with money. It was not filled with stolen jewelry or gold bars. It was filled with stacks of old paper. I reached inside and pulled out the first stack. They were letters. Dozens of handwritten letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon. I recognized the elegant looping cursive handwriting immediately. It was my grandmother's handwriting. I slid the ribbon off and opened the top envelope. The paper was crisp and well preserved. I unfolded the letter and began to read. "My dearest Corinne," the letter began. "If you are reading this, it means I have passed on from this earth. I am writing these letters to you because I see the way your parents treat you. I see the cruelty in your mother's eyes when she looks at you. I see the weakness in your father's heart when he refuses to protect you. I see how they worship Trayvon and how they try to crush your beautiful spirit. You are the only one in this family with true vision and true strength. Do not let them break you." My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I flipped through the stack of envelopes. There were letters for my high school graduation, letters for my college graduation, letters for my eventual wedding day, letters full of love and guidance and absolute unwavering support. My grandmother had written them all before she died, intending for me to have them as I navigated my life. And my parents had stolen them. They had locked them away in a dark safe so I would never know someone in this family actually loved me. I looked at Calvin, who was still weeping against the wall. "You monsters!" I whispered, my voice cracking with a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief and rage. "You could not stand the thought that she loved me more than she loved your golden child. You stole my only source of comfort." But the letters were not the only thing in the safe. Marcus reached into the back of the steel box and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope bearing the official seal of an upscale Boston law firm. He handed it to me, his expression grim. I opened the heavy clasp and slid the documents out. It was a last will and testament. It was fully notarized and signed by my grandmother, dated just 3 weeks before she passed away from sudden heart failure. I read the first page, and the breath completely left my lungs. The grandmother had not left the historic estate to Calvin and Brenda. She knew exactly how financially irresponsible and morally bankrupt they were. The legal document clearly stated that the entire estate, the mansion, the 20 acres of land, and the antique furnishings were to be placed into a direct trust exclusively in the name of Corinne Blackwell. She had left everything directly to me. My hands began to shake as I read the inheritance clauses. The estate was mine. It had always been mine. Brenda and Calvin had deliberately hidden the secondary will. They had used an older, outdated version of her will to claim the estate for themselves so they could eventually use it to fund Trayvon's fraudulent lifestyle. They had stolen my inheritance to feed his ego. I held the heavy parchment paper in my hands, feeling the textured seal under my fingertips. The silence in the dusty attic was absolute. Calvin was still pressed against the slanted wall, watching my eyes scan the legal document. He knew exactly what I was reading. The dark secret he had kept buried for 8 years was now entirely exposed in the harsh light of Marcus' tactical flashlight. "This is not just a family dispute anymore, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "This is inheritance fraud. You and Mom concealed a legally binding document to steal millions of dollars worth of property from your own daughter. That is a federal and state felony." Calvin began to shake his head back and forth, his hands coming up to grip his thin, graying hair. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had finally snapped shut. His chest heaved as panic completely overtook him. "I did not want to do it, Corinne," Calvin stammered, his voice breaking into a pathetic whine. "It was her idea. It was all Brenda's idea. She found the new will in your grandmother's desk the day after she passed. She said you did not need the house. She said you were already smart and independent, and Trayvon was the one who needed the legacy. She made me hide it, Corinne. She told me God would forgive us because we were protecting our son." I stared at the man who had preached from a pulpit about honesty and integrity for my entire life. He was throwing his wife of 40 years under the bus without a single second of hesitation, just to save his own skin. The utter cowardice of it all was staggering. "Get up," I commanded, pointing toward the stairs. "We are going downstairs to share this revelation with your wonderful wife." Marcus grabbed Calvin by the arm and hauled him to his feet. We marched down the 3 flights of stairs, leaving the hidden safe wide open in the dark. The main floor was still a chaotic mess of cheap cardboard boxes and packing tape. Brenda was standing near the grand entryway, barking orders at Trayvon, who was lazily tossing a few designer shoes into a plastic bin. When Brenda saw us coming down the main staircase, her eyes immediately locked onto the thick manila envelope in my hand. The last remaining color drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and sickly. She took a step backward, bumping into a stack of boxes. "Corinne," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute terror. "What are you holding?" I walked straight up to her and held the document up so she could see the official law firm's seal. "I found the real will, Mom," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The one you stole from grandmother's desk? The one that proves this entire estate has legally belonged to me for the past 8 years. Brenda let out a high-pitched gasp, bringing both hands over her mouth. Trayvon dropped the shoe he was holding. It hit the marble floor with a loud thud. He looked from the document to his mother, and then back to me, his eyes wide with confusion and rising fear. "What does that mean?" Trayvon asked, his voice cracking. "What real will?" "It means your parents are criminals, Trayvon," I said, turning my icy gaze toward him. "It means they committed major fraud to steal my inheritance so they could use my property as collateral for your fake real estate company. It means this eviction is no longer just a civil matter. It is a criminal investigation. My lawyers are contacting the district attorney this morning. Your parents are going to prison for inheritance fraud." Trayvon stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him. He looked at Calvin, who was refusing to make eye contact, staring at the floor in complete shame. He looked at Brenda, who was shaking uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. The reality of the situation crashed down on Trayvon with crushing force. His wife was already in federal custody for wire fraud. His business was completely bankrupt. And now his parents were facing felony charges for stealing an estate to fund his lies. Trayvon realized in that exact moment that the sinking ship was finally going under, and he had absolutely no intention of drowning with it. He looked around the grand foyer, his eyes darting frantically, looking for an escape route. "Trayvon, sweetheart," Brenda cried out, reaching a shaking hand toward him. "We did it for you. We just wanted to make sure you had the foundation you needed to be a strong man. We sacrificed everything to protect you." Trayvon looked at his mother's outstretched hand with pure, unadulterated disgust. "You are crazy," he yelled, his voice shrill and panicked. "You are both completely crazy. I never told you to steal a will. I never told you to commit a felony. You are going to drag me down with you. The police are going to think I was part of this." Trayvon, Brenda sobbed, taking a step toward him. "Please do not turn away from us. We are your parents. We love you." "Get away from me!" Trayvon screamed, backing toward the front door. He looked wildly around the foyer, his breathing shallow and rapid. Then his gaze locked onto Calvin's suit jacket draped over a chair near the entryway. Trayvon lunged for the jacket, digging his hands frantically into the pockets. "What are you doing?" Calvin demanded, stepping forward, but Marcus blocked his path, holding out a massive arm. Trayvon pulled out Calvin's dark leather wallet. He ripped it open and snatched the only remaining emergency credit card Calvin had managed to keep hidden from the bankruptcy lawyers. He shoved the wallet back onto the chair and gripped the plastic card like it was a life preserver. Trayvon, no! Calvin shouted, his voice breaking with genuine despair. That is all we have left. That is for food and a motel room tonight. You are going to jail anyway, Trayvon spat back, retreating toward the open double doors. I need this more than you do. I have to get out of this state before the police start asking questions. He turned and sprinted out the door. Brenda let out a guttural scream of pure agony and chased after him, her expensive running shoes slipping on the marble floor. Calvin followed right behind her, his face twisted in disbelief. I walked out onto the grand stone porch with Marcus standing right beside me to watch the final act of their miserable family dynamic play out on the front lawn. Trayvon ran straight toward the faded gray 2008 Honda Civic parked at the end of the circular driveway. The car I had lived in when they refused to help me. The car I had given him the keys to just a few days ago. He yanked the driver's side door open and threw himself inside. Brenda reached the car just as Trayvon started the engine. The old motor coughed and sputtered before roaring to life. She slammed her hands against the driver's side window, tears pouring down her face, ruining her carefully applied makeup. Trayvon, please, she wailed, her voice carrying across the sprawling manicured lawns of the neighborhood. Do not leave us here. We have nothing. We did this all for you. You are my baby boy. Please open the door. Trayvon did not even look at her. He shifted the car into reverse and slammed his foot on the gas pedal. The tires screeched against the pavement, leaving dark black marks on the pristine stone driveway. Brenda stumbled backward, crying out as she nearly fell onto the grass. Trayvon whipped the car around, putting it into drive, and sped out of the grand iron gates without a single backward glance. He left his parents stranded on the curb, surrounded by cheap cardboard boxes with absolutely no money and a looming criminal investigation. The silence that fell over the estate was profound. The wealthy neighbors who had been watching the spectacle from their porches were completely speechless. The great Blackwell family had been entirely dismantled, and the golden child had proven himself to be the ultimate coward. Brenda stood in the driveway staring at the empty road where the Honda Civic had disappeared. Her shoulders shook with heavy, violent sobs. The illusion she had spent her entire life protecting was completely shattered. Her perfect son had abandoned her, taking their last lifeline with him. She had sacrificed her morals, her religion, her daughter, and her freedom for a boy who did not even hesitate to rob her on his way out the door. She slowly turned around to face the mansion. She looked up at the grand stone columns and the massive windows. And then she looked at me standing calmly on the porch, looking down at her from the top of the stairs. Calvin was standing a few feet away from her, staring at the ground, completely broken. He had nothing left to say. His authority was gone. His pride was gone. He was just a shell of a man waiting for the authorities to arrive. He did not even try to comfort his wife. He just stood there, letting the reality of federal prison wash over him. Brenda slowly walked toward the porch, her steps heavy and defeated. She stopped at the bottom of the stone stairs, looking up at me with eyes so full of despair and genuine regret, it almost looked foreign on her face. The smug, arrogant woman who had slapped me in the lobby of my own company was completely gone. She was stripped bare of all her weaponized privilege and manufactured holy grace. Corinne, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her tears. He left us. Trayvon left us here with nothing. He took the card. He just drove away after everything we sacrificed for him. I looked down at her, feeling no satisfaction, just a cold, hollow emptiness. I told you exactly who he was, Mom. I said, my voice quiet and steady. You just refused to listen. You love the idea of a successful son more than you love the reality of your actual daughter. You let him walk all over me because you thought he was going to be the one to carry the family legacy. Look at your legacy now. Brenda fell to her knees on the hard stone driveway. She brought her hands up to her face, sobbing loudly. I am so sorry, Corinne, she cried, her voice breaking into pathetic, jagged pieces. I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. We were blinded by pride. We made terrible mistakes, but you are our blood. You are our only daughter. Please, Corinne, you have so much. You have the company and the money, and now you have the estate. Please do not let us go to prison. Do not leave us out here on the street. We are begging you. Have mercy on your family." I stood on the porch looking at the woman who had stolen my high school savings, the woman who had denied me a car for college, the woman who had sat back and watched her son extort me, the woman who had stolen my grandmother's dying words of love just to protect her fragile ego. She was asking for mercy after spending 32 years showing me none. A sleek black Maybach pulled smoothly into the circular driveway, stopping right in front of the stone steps. The driver got out and immediately opened the rear passenger door for me. I walked down the stone steps, my heels clicking rhythmically against the granite. I stepped past Calvin, who flinched slightly as I walked by. I stopped right next to where Brenda was kneeling on the pavement. She looked up at me, her tear-streaked face filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. She reached a shaking hand out toward the hem of my crimson power suit. I looked down at her, my expression completely blank. I felt absolutely nothing for the strangers sobbing on my driveway. The little girl who had desperately wanted her mother's love was long dead, and Brenda was the one who had buried her. "I am not your daughter," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and devoid of any emotion. "I am your landlord, and your lease is up." I stepped into the leather interior of the Maybach and settled into the seat. My driver closed the heavy door, silencing Brenda's frantic wails. I did not look out the tinted window as the luxury car glided smoothly down the driveway and out through the iron gates, leaving them sitting on the sidewalk, surrounded by the ruins of their own making. 2 months passed since I drove away from the estate, leaving my parents sitting on the curb. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of legal proceedings and corporate restructuring. My position as chief executive officer was permanently solidified, and my $80 million company was entirely secure. The criminal investigation against my parents was moving forward rapidly. They were currently living in a cheap weekly motel while they awaited trial for inheritance fraud and grand larceny. I did not check on them. I did not call them. For the first time in my life, I completely severed the toxic cord that tied me to their constant manipulation. But severing contact did not immediately erase 32 years of emotional damage. The physical distance was easy, but the mental healing was brutal. I started attending intensive therapy twice a week. My therapist, Dr. Evans, helped me unpack the deep trauma of being the designated family scapegoat. She helped me realize that my parents' inability to love me was a reflection of their own brokenness and not a measure of my worth. I had to actively unlearn the belief that my value was tied to how much abuse I could endure. It was a painful process of grieving the family I never actually had. To replace the family I had lost, I intentionally surrounded myself with people who actually wanted to see me win. I built a powerful network of successful Black female mentors, women who ran their own tech companies and investment firms. We met for weekly dinners where we celebrated our victories and supported each other through our challenges. There was no jealousy or competition. It was a sisterhood of brilliant women who lifted each other up instead of tearing each other down. They listened to my business ideas with genuine interest and offered guidance when I navigated complex corporate deals. They became the real family I had always desperately craved. As my mental health improved, I had to make a final decision regarding my grandmother's historic estate. The massive colonial mansion and the 20 acres of land officially belonged to me now. My lawyers suggested selling the property to a luxury real estate developer for a massive profit. But the house was entirely tainted by my parents' greed and their decades of fraud. It was the place where they had hidden the real will and stolen my letters. It was the place where they had worshipped Trayvon and treated me like a burden. I could not let another family live inside those walls. The very foundation felt poisoned by their lies, so I did the only thing that made sense. I called a demolition company. I stood on the edge of the property on a crisp Tuesday morning and watched 3 massive yellow bulldozers tear the colonial mansion to the ground. The heavy steel claws ripped through the grand foyer where Brenda had screamed at me. They crushed the grand staircase and smashed the roof into thousands of jagged pieces. Plaster and shattered glass rained down into the grass, sending huge clouds of gray dust into the air. The wealthy neighbors stood on their porches watching the destruction in absolute shock. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness as the walls collapsed. I felt an overwhelming sense of absolute liberation. The physical monument to my childhood suffering was being erased from the earth forever. Once the rubble was entirely cleared away, the land was just an empty canvas. I did not want to sell it to strangers. I wanted to transform the pain of my past into a beacon of hope for the future. I used a significant portion of my wealth to establish a massive educational foundation. I hired the best architects in the city to design a state-of-the-art facility right there on the empty 20 acres. We broke ground on a cutting-edge science, technology, engineering, and math academy designed exclusively for young African American girls. The campus would feature advanced robotics labs and coding centers and an expansive outdoor space where young girls could safely explore their brilliance. I was going to use my $80 million to fund the exact dreams my parents had tried so hard to kill inside of me. I wanted to create a space where brilliant young minds were nurtured instead of crushed. No girl who walked through those future doors would ever be told that her ambition was a waste of time. They would not have to hide their piggy banks to save for a laptop. They would be handed the tools to build their own empires from the very first day. The grand ribbon-cutting ceremony took place on a bright Saturday morning. The foundation had set up a beautiful stage on the freshly cleared land. Hundreds of community leaders and future students were gathered on the lawn. I stood at the podium wearing a sharp white tailored suit, surrounded by my new network of female mentors. The energy in the air was absolutely electric. I looked out at the sea of smiling faces, feeling a profound sense of peace. My heart felt completely full. I raised a giant pair of silver scissors and cut the thick red ribbon, officially dedicating the land to the new academy. The crowd erupted into massive applause and loud cheers. I stepped down from the stage, hugging my friends and taking pictures with the excited young girls who would soon walk the halls of the academy. It was the happiest day of my entire life. As I was walking toward the catering tent, my cell phone began to vibrate in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a congratulatory text from my legal team or my head of security. Instead, the bright screen displayed an unknown out-of-state number. I excused myself from the loud crowd and walked toward a quiet corner of the property near the old iron gates. I pressed the phone to my ear and answered the call. A pre-recorded automated voice immediately filled the line. "You have a collect call from a federal inmate at the Danbury Correctional Facility," the robotic voice announced. "Please hold to accept the call from Ashley." I pressed the button to accept the charges. The line clicked loudly and a sharp burst of static filled my ear, followed by the dull, echoing sounds of a crowded room. "Hello, Corinne," a voice rasped through the receiver. It was Ashley. Her usually haughty and condescending tone was completely gone. She sounded small and terrified. Her voice was shaking so violently I could barely understand her words. "Corinne, please do not hang up," she begged, her breath hitching in her throat. "I have nobody else to call. Everyone has completely blocked my number. My parents will not even speak to me anymore." I listened to her frantic sobbing, feeling absolutely nothing. The woman who had sneered at me across a luxury steakhouse table and demanded my entire company was now reduced to a weeping mess in a federal holding facility. "I am looking at 20 years, Corinne," she wailed. 20 years in federal prison. Trayvon left me. He completely abandoned me. As soon as the indictment came down, he filed for divorce. He took the last bit of cash I had hidden away, and he vanished. He told the federal prosecutors that the entire embezzlement scheme was my idea. He told them I manipulated him and forged the church documents. Because my signature was on the primary loan applications, the prosecutors believed him. They are pinning the entire wire fraud and corporate theft on me. He threw me to the wolves to save himself. I stood near the heavy iron gates of my property, watching the joyous crowd in the distance. Trayvon had done exactly what I knew he would do. He was a coward who always needed a scapegoat. When I was younger, I was his scapegoat. Now that he had ruined his own marriage, Ashley was the perfect target. He let her take the fall for his massive financial crimes. "Corinne, please." Ashley sobbed, her voice echoing against the sterile prison walls. The public defender they gave me is terrible. He is telling me to take a plea deal that carries a 15-year mandatory sentence. I will not survive in here for 15 years. I need a real defense team. I need high-powered corporate lawyers. You have $80 million, Corinne. You can afford the best legal team in the country. You can pay my bail. We are family, Corinne. I am the mother of your future nieces and nephews. You cannot just let me rot in a concrete cell while you build schools. Please just pay for a lawyer. I will pay you back every single cent. I swear on my life I will pay you back. I listened to her pathetic begging as the warm morning breeze brushed past my face. I remembered how she had smirked when Traven tried to steal my life's work. I remembered how she had plotted to steal my grandmother's estate. I brought the phone closer to my mouth. I do not invest in bad assets, I said, my voice perfectly smooth and ice cold. I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, disconnecting the line immediately. I blocked the prison facility number and slipped the sleek phone back into my tailored suit jacket. I turned away from the gate and looked out over the massive campus of my new academy. It was incredibly satisfying to know exactly where the people who had abused me ended up. My private investigators had kept me fully updated on the miserable lives my family was now leading. Trayvon, the supposed golden child and brilliant real estate mogul, was currently living a nightmare of his own making. He had fled the state in my old, faded 2008 Honda Civic, trying to outrun the federal investigators and his angry creditors. He ended up 3 states away, living in a rundown trailer park. Without his parents' money to fund his expensive suits, and without his arrogant charm to manipulate investors, Trayvon had absolutely nothing. He was working the graveyard shift at a greasy fast food drive-thru. The man who used to mock my clothing and demand expensive steaks was now wearing a polyester uniform that permanently smelled of burnt fryer oil and cheap onions. He spent his nights handing out soggy French fries to drunk teenagers and angry truck drivers. When his shifts ended at 6 in the morning, he dragged himself back to the cold, cramped interior of the Honda Civic. He folded the back seats down, just like I had suggested, and slept in the freezing car because he could not afford to pay rent anywhere else. The golden boy had lost his shine entirely. He was a balding, exhausted man trapped in a cycle of minimum wage poverty with a federal investigation still looming over his head. Brenda and Calvin were suffering an even worse fate. After being evicted from the historic estate and having all their assets seized by the federal government, they were forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment in a dangerous part of the city. The contrast between their sprawling colonial mansion and their new reality was absolutely staggering. The apartment had peeling yellow wallpaper and a persistent mold problem in the bathroom. The walls were paper-thin, and they could hear their neighbors fighting at all hours of the night. They had been completely and publicly exiled from Greater Zion Fellowship. The church elders had banned them from the property, and the wealthy women Brenda used to play bridge with now crossed the street whenever they saw her walking toward the discount grocery store. All of their prestigious social standing was gone. They were local pariahs known only as the pastors who stole from their own congregation. Calvin was a broken, pathetic shell of a man. He spent his days sitting in a cheap folding chair staring blankly at a tiny television screen, completely stripped of his authority and his pride. He refused to look for a job. Brenda was even worse. She paced the cramped apartment, wearing the same stained tracksuit day after day, bitterly complaining about how unfair the world was. They spent every waking moment screaming at each other. Brenda blamed Calvin for not hiding the grandmother's will better, and Calvin blamed Brenda for raising a son who would steal their last credit card and abandon them on the curb. They were trapped in a miserable, suffocating prison of their own creation, with absolutely no hope of ever escaping. They had chosen a life of lies, and now they were forced to choke on the truth. I walked slowly back toward the center of the campus, leaving the thoughts of my toxic family behind me. The transformation of this property was the proudest achievement of my entire life. Where the dark, oppressive colonial mansion had once stood there, was now a stunning architectural masterpiece. The STEM Academy for Young African American Girls was a sprawling complex made of gleaming glass panels and smooth white stone. The roof was lined with advanced solar panels that powered the entire facility. The outdoor courtyard featured a massive botanical garden and a state-of-the-art astronomical observatory. I had poured my heart and my wealth into creating a sanctuary for brilliant young minds. Inside the glass walls, there were cutting-edge robotics laboratories and advanced coding centers. There were chemistry labs outfitted with equipment that rivaled top universities. I wanted these young girls to have every single advantage that my parents had tried to deny me. I wanted them to know that their ambition was beautiful and their intelligence was a weapon that no one could ever take away from them. The official opening day ceremonies were shifting into the main auditorium. I walked through the double glass doors and was immediately greeted by the loud, joyful sounds of hundreds of people. The auditorium was packed to the absolute brim. My network of powerful Black female mentors occupied the front rows, wearing vibrant colors and looking at me with genuine sisterly pride. Behind them sat the community leaders, the dedicated teachers I had personally hired, and the local politicians who had fully supported the project. But the most important people in the room were the students. The first incoming class of young girls sat together wearing their crisp new uniforms. Their eyes were wide with wonder and excitement as they looked around the incredible facility. I walked up the steps to the main stage and stood behind the sleek modern podium. The room instantly fell silent. Hundreds of faces looked up at me, waiting for me to speak. I looked down at the young girls in the front row, seeing reflections of my younger self in their bright, hopeful eyes. I adjusted the microphone and took a deep, calming breath. "Welcome to your new home," I said, my voice echoing clearly through the massive auditorium. For a very long time, I was told that my dreams were too big. I was told that my ideas were foolish and that I should shrink myself to make other people comfortable. I was told that I did not belong at the table of success. But I learned a very important lesson. When people refuse to give you a seat at their table, you do not beg them for a chair. You take your tools and you build your own table. And then you invite everyone who looks like you to sit down and eat. The crowd erupted into massive applause. The young girls in the front row were smiling so brightly it made my chest ache with absolute joy. "This academy is your table," I continued, raising my voice over the applause. "You will never have to shrink yourselves in these halls. You will never be told that your brilliant minds are a waste of time. You will be scientists and engineers and coders and CEOs. You will build the future of this world and no one will ever be able to take your power away from you. You are the legacy and you are unstoppable." The entire auditorium rose to their feet in a massive standing ovation. The applause was deafening. My mentors were cheering loudly, and the young students were jumping up and down, clapping their hands. I looked out at the sea of beautiful, supportive faces, and I knew with absolute certainty that I had finally won. I had taken the deepest trauma of my childhood and transformed it into a legacy of power and light. The estate that had once been a monument to my parents' greed was now a beacon of hope for generations of girls who would change the world. I smiled, waving to the crowd as I stepped down from the podium. My friends immediately surrounded me, pulling me into warm, genuine hugs. We laughed and celebrated as the event transitioned into a massive reception in the courtyard. The air was filled with music and joy and the promise of a beautiful future. I walked over to a quiet table near the edge of the courtyard to take a sip of water. As I set my glass down, I felt my phone vibrate in my tailored pocket. I pulled the sleek device out and looked at the bright screen. It was a text message from an unknown number with an out-of-state area code. I tapped the screen and opened the message. "Corinne, it is Trayvon. I am using a coworker's phone. My car broke down and I cannot afford to fix it. I lost my job at the drive-thru because I was late. I have not eaten in 2 days. The police came by the trailer park asking questions about the fraud charges. I am terrified, Corinne. I have absolutely nothing left. Mom and Dad will not answer my calls and Ashley is in prison. You are my sister. You are all I have. Please, I am begging you. Just send me enough money for a bus ticket. Please help me." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the pathetic, desperate words of the golden child who had finally hit rock bottom. He was begging for scraps from the sister he had spent his entire life trying to destroy. I looked up from the screen and watched the young girls running across the courtyard, laughing and pointing at the robotics lab. They were safe, and they were supported, and they were entirely free. I looked back down at the phone. I did not feel angry, and I did not feel sad. I just felt a profound, permanent indifference. I pressed the delete button, watching Traven's miserable message vanish into the digital void. I blocked the unknown number, ensuring he could never reach me again. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turned my back on the past, and walked confidently toward my real family. The ultimate lesson of this story is that family is defined by mutual respect and genuine support, not just blood relations. Corinne spent her entire life seeking validation from parents who only valued their golden child. She endured emotional abuse and financial sabotage, but she ultimately realized that her worth was not tied to their toxic approval. By walking away from their manipulation, she reclaimed her power and built an incredible life on her own terms. True justice comes not from seeking revenge, but from setting unbreakable boundaries and redirecting your energy into building a legacy of your own. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave the past behind to protect your future. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe to our channel for more videos about healing and finding your true power.